welcome back to Harvest here online. We're so glad that you decided to join us today wherever you're watching and whenever you're watching, wherever you're watching from. Thanks so much for making us a part of your day. We would love for you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and we would love for you to share this message if it's meaningful, maybe a neighbor, a friend, a family member, or somebody like that. Also, you can check out some of our podcasts here on the YouTube station as well. You can also roll over to where you get your podcasts and find Behind the Harvest podcast, and you can check out more about what we're talking about in this series from different angles and some different voices as well. We would love for you to check that out. Also, you can go to harvest247.org. That's our website. Check that out as well. And you can go over to Facebook and Instagram, harvest.247. We would love for you to like and subscribe and follow all of those pages. We're so glad that you decided to join us. We are in the middle of a series called The Space Between Us, how we are navigating and living through a world of political and cultural division. And so today we're going to talk about this idea of faith versus fear. Now, my grandmother was a very scared individual, especially when it came to storms. This is actually a true story. When I was a kid and I would stay with her, especially in the summertime in Georgia, we would have afternoon storms. And so if there was a really bad thunderstorm, she would take us out into the car, me and my other cousins, take us into the car, put towels over our face, and wait for the storm to pass, which seems very, very weird. And her rationale behind it was she didn't want to see the lightning, so we put the towel over it, and then the rubber on the tires would prevent us from getting struck by lightning. So anyway, she was really, really afraid of storms. And so that would actually make me afraid of storms, or my cousins afraid of storms, of course, till my dad put me out on a screen porch with a storm and made me sit out there and say, hey, there's nothing wrong with it. But the problem is that her fear of storms was influencing my fear of storms at an early age. And if you've ever been around someone who's really afraid, their fear can influence your fear. Just by being around them, being afraid of who knows what, can actually make you afraid of that same thing or other things if you're not careful, because fear is contagious, right? If you're around people, a friend group, a spouse, a kid, a neighbor, or whatnot, fear is contagious. And the reason that fear is contagious is because things happen, right, that make us afraid. There's really bad storms, right? There's reasons to lock our door and turn on the security system. I mean, there's reasons to put on our seatbelt. I mean, there's reasons, right? Because things happen, and because things have happened, right? There's things that have happened in your life. There's things that have happened in my life that should give us a healthy fear of certain things, but not overly fearful. And especially if we're believers and we're following Jesus, there's a respectful, a healthy fear, but we are not to live in fear or be fearful. But things happen and things have happened, and therefore fear becomes personal. Our past experiences, stories we've heard, all of a sudden fear becomes personal, right? We have experiences. We hear stories that happen on the news. We hear stories about what's happened in our communities with other people. I mean, fear happens, right? The realities that so many of us are facing regularly are enough to make us live fearful, right? But it would not be great to let fear be the driving force of how we live our life. A lot of times, if you get the news and you're on the news and you're reading the news, the pages are just filled with stories of fear, right? Things that would make us fearful, things that would make us live a fearful life, right? But we are not supposed to actually do that, right? As believers, we're not supposed to live like that. And so we are having, though, to come to grips and terms with fear that isn't outlandish at all, which makes this time that we're living in so unique than it ever has before, because a lot of the things that we fear, whether it be financial collapse, world wars, outrageous crime, what's the country going to look like for our kids and our grandkids, a lot of those things are actually not outlandish at all to be afraid of, right? I mean, fear seems very real. It seems like it's insistent, and it seems like it's consistent. I mean, if you just go to whatever news source you get your news from and you scroll down, like typically the first 5 news stories are like the worst things that you could hear about, right? I mean, it seems like it's insistent and consistent. And our fear is actually based on actual events, like things that are happening now that are like, man, one day after the next, you just don't know what the news story of the day is going to be. And in fact, in this political cycle, there have been just unprecedented event after unprecedented event that have happened just like almost on top of one another to where you can't even catch your breath. It's like being in the ocean and a wave coming and you get put down in the water and then all of a sudden you're trying to get up and another wave is coming. It's crazy. I mean, there's real injustices. There are legitimate worries out there. And we are having to live in a culture with the idea of that. And no matter what side you find yourself on, in the culture wars or in politics or whatnot, like there are legitimate fears on both sides. And so the challenge for us to live in this type of society is, how do we live in this type of society without feeling fear, right? And so the question that I have for us, and the question I have for me, question I have for you is this: is the fear I feel about God, and do I deem him incapable of handling my fear? Right? Like, do I deem God incapable of handling the circumstances and the issues and the fears of today? Well, there's a story in Mark 4 that is a pretty simple story, but I think it could help us understand our fear and help us know what we need to do to combat fear. And here's what it says, Mark 4, starting in verse 35. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. So you can picture, you're on a boat, it's wavy, there's storms, and the boat's rocking. Of course, I'm sure the disciples are like, "Oh my goodness, what is going on?" And Jesus is asleep, okay? And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" It's a very interesting question. Do you not care that we are perishing? Now, no one in the story yet has been thrown overboard. No one is hanging off the side that we know of. But think about the question. Do you not care that we are perishing? Right? They're in the midst of a storm and they believe they are perishing. Verse 39, and he woke and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" So let's talk a little bit about the context of this passage of Scripture. It is important what Jesus says at the beginning. He says, "Let us go across to the other side," meaning he is making a promise that we are going to make it on the other side. It doesn't matter the circumstances that happen in the middle between leaving and getting to the other side. What Jesus is saying is, hey, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make it to the other side, regardless of the circumstances that we don't know are going to happen. I mean, he knows what's going to happen, but they didn't know what was going to happen. We are going to make it to the other side. He doesn't say, let us go and we might die before we get to the other side. I mean, this is going to be a treacherous trip. I mean, we better hang on for dear life. I don't know if we're going to make it or not, right? But he said, no, we're going to go to the other side. The other thing that it says is that they took him even as he was. This message is to us. We take Jesus not as we wish he was, not as others may present Jesus as, not as you might see him in others' lives, but we have to take Jesus as he is, as the Bible presents him, as we know him to be, as he describes himself, right? We have to take Jesus not as who the Bible tells us he is, that he has power over all things in creation, right? And so we have to take him as he is. Now, in the context, the Sea of Galilee is known for its sudden violent storms. So a sudden storm rising up is not uncommon. And you're talking about disciples who were a bunch of fishermen. don't you think that they knew this? Don't you think they had been through these types of storms before? Right? It wasn't uncommon. And if you spend any amount of time on the sea, it's not uncommon to have a storm. I've been on like 10 cruises in my life. I would probably say 5 of the 10 cruises, at some point, we hit some rocky ocean, right? And the boat starts swaying, right, back and forth. I remember one time we were watching, doing bingo or something, and I could look out to the left side, and the glass would fill with water. And then it would fill with sky, and then it would fill with water. I've been on boats before where it just keeps rocking through the night, right? I've been on it where we see white-capped waves, right? So if you're in the water at any point in time, it's not uncommon to run into some rough waves. Just like if you fly, it's not uncommon to hit some turbulence like you're going to. Right? It's just part of the deal, right? Part of the journey. So for these guys, it's interesting that they would be so afraid of a sudden storm when they were fishermen, and I would be willing to bet they had handled it and been through it before. It is in the storm, though, that you see the humanity of Jesus. He's sleeping. Like, he's asleep. You know, it's like early on when I would fly and we would hit turbulence, and I would look to the guy to my left and he's just passed out. And I'm like, how can you be passed out? We're in the middle of the air and falling and all of this kind of stuff. He's just asleep, right? But you see his humanity in this. Like, he's resting, right? Jesus is fully God and he's fully man. That's what we believe, right? The dual nature of Christ. Think of the worries that could have kept Jesus awake, though, right? He could worry about the religious and the political leaders who plotted against him, but he wasn't. He could have worried about his family who thought he was crazy, but he didn't. He could worry about the overwhelming crowds with their overwhelming needs, but that didn't really keep him awake. He could worry about the disciples that he chose. Did he choose the right people, right? He didn't worry about that. He could worry about the future because he knew what his destiny was. He knew he was going to go to the cross, right, and have to experience that horrific death, but he wasn't. He just wasn't worried. But I think it's important to point out, and it's something that one of the commentaries that I read about this passage said, and I think it's so important for us, is that Jesus' sleep was not just a sleep of weariness. Like, I'm just tired and I just got to sleep. It was a rest of faith. That he rested by faith, right? He just knew. He knew that he was in control. He knew God was in control. And so his rest is a rest of deep-seated faith. With all of those things, that list that he could have worried about, he rested in faith and by faith, right? And all of a sudden, here come the disciples. They woke him. The wind didn't wake him. I'm sure the screaming and arguing disciples didn't wake him, right? I'm sure they were arguing, do we wake Jesus up? Do we get him up? I don't know. He's sleeping. Do we disturb him? I mean, what are we going to do? I mean, that's what we would do, right? Think about, just put yourself in that situation. He wasn't woken up by the water splashing over the side and rocking the boat. That didn't wake him. The cry of his disciples, though, instantly woke him. And I think that is so important when we talk about not only Jesus' humanity, but Jesus' divinity, that the cry of the disciples instantly woke him. It's like a sleeping mother who is sound asleep, and one peep from her child, she wakes up immediately, right? Can be sound asleep, and then all of a sudden the kid makes a noise and she's up, right? Why? She wakes immediately. And so what it shows is that in the midst of our fear, Jesus doesn't rush to condemn us. He wakes to comfort us. And his conversation to the disciples was, I'm going to calm the sea. I'm going to take care of the storm. And now that I've taken care of the storm, do you still have no faith? And I think in this story, the idea of faith gives us our antidote to fear. And that faith is the greatest weapon against fear. That us understanding who God is, what he is capable of, how he can handle certain circumstances, that faith becomes our greatest weapon against fear. In fact, Jesus even told his disciples in Matthew 24 about what was going to happen toward the end of the earth. And right now, with all the circumstances going on, we believe, hey, Jesus, if you're a believer at all, if you've been following Jesus for any length of time, you're like, oh, this is the end times, it's the end times. And Jesus told his disciples, he said, as he was looking forward, he says, listen, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and there's going to be all these things happening in the world. But then he says, but don't let your heart be troubled, meaning don't fear. These things must happen for the end to come. And so it's like in this story and in the circumstance that we are dealing with today, one of the things that shines through is that faith becomes our greatest weapon against fear. Us taking Jesus for who he is, for what the Bible tells us he is, for what he's shown us in our life, overcoming helping us navigate so many difficult circumstances. Our faith becomes the greatest weapon against fear. And it's one of those things that we have to almost deploy as we're living in a political culture that's trying to divide us and making us fearful. And we're living in a culture that's making us fearful. And so he says, why are you so afraid? I got it. I've got it. I can calm the sea, and you can rest not out of weariness, but in faith that I am in control of everything. I'm in control of everything that you're going to experience. I'm in control of everything your children are going to experience. The future for your children, I got it. Who's going to win the election? I got it. It's at my discretion that men are made great and given much strength. And what's going to happen to our culture? I got it. What's going to happen to your personal finances? Guess what? I'm the provider. I got it. Like what's going to happen in the world with world wars and things like that? Guess what? Don't be afraid. Some of these things have to happen. There's going to be rumors of wars. There's going to be wars. They have to happen for the end to come. Guess what? I got it. And so for us as followers of Jesus, trying to navigate this world that we live in, faith becomes our greatest weapon against fear. And that our rest, our sleep isn't out of a place of weariness. Maybe it is. Maybe you're just exhausted. Go to sleep. But it's also a rest that's deeply rooted to our faith that says, I can sleep because I know when I sleep, Jesus is still awake. He's still in control. It's one of the things we tell our kids. We've done this from the beginning. Since our oldest, Caleb, would wake up and be afraid, all right, or go to bed and be afraid, we would say, you know what the good news is that Jesus never sleeps. He's always awake. He's always aware of what's going on, and he is always with you. You don't have to be afraid. He's always awake, even when you sleep. So for us, as we navigate this, we can't allow our fear to lead us to disbelief, because that's what the disciples did, right? They saw, even though they had been through the storm before, even though they had been on a rocking boat before, even though they knew that these things happened, they allowed the fear of the moment to lead them to disbelief. We can't allow that to happen. What we have to do as we navigate this culture and this politics, political cycle and all of these things that are happening, some of these things that are unprecedented, some of these things haven't happened in like 50 years, 60 years. We have to rest in faith and know that we have to deploy that faith, because faith becomes our greatest weapon against fear. And the way that we walk out in faith is that we take Jesus for who he says he is and who the Bible says he is, which he is the one Lord over all things. Right? He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He's omnipresent. He decides who the world leaders are. And he's the one that has told us even in Matthew 24, guys, don't fear. Don't worry. Don't let your heart be troubled. So, as we navigate this really turbulent political and cultural divide, as followers of Jesus, we want faith become our greatest weapon against fear. See you next week. God bless you.